Hey everybody, I don't know about you, but I had to teach myself how to learn as a student in the era of my college EMT firefighting education days. And we've done a better job, I think, in education in trying to address that a bit. But for many of you, maybe you haven't caught that course yet, or you haven't caught that topic yet. But it's really important actually before you start taking any course. But when you think about taking a course like EMT, firefighter, courses in law enforcement, military training, any of these things are very high stakes and for a very obvious reason, right? So it's important that if you want to be successful in this, you know as much as possible, right? Number one. Number two, in order to do that, you really have to manage all the things in your life, but also this very large amount, and sometimes it lasts for a long time, this very full amount of education that you're going to have to be taking, where maybe even you're taking classes that are happening at the same time in a semester, but are on different topics that maybe don't line up really well. Happens all the time in college education. So with this video, I'd like to just spend a little bit of your time preparing you how to learn, or if you're in the middle of learning, maybe give you some strategies to help you become more efficient on your way to your training in public safety, whatever that is. I'll be using specific examples today for my paramedic team in the fast track program at CNM. But aside from the idea that this is going to be for education, that today is talking a little bit about paramedic textbooks, for example, it's going to apply to all types of public safety and military training. All right. So let's get started. So I think a very important part of starting, right? Where do you start? All right, let's get started. So when you're thinking about studying, getting ready for your training and or in the middle of training, you've got to have a set of strategies to help guide you through. Now, I'll use specific examples today from courses that I'm teaching, but whether or not some of these things are at play in your actual course, generally these rules will still apply in the teacher to student management of education, okay? Now, to step back and think about, even in 2023, there are some basics of education that still work and have worked for a very long time. One of the biggest things to consider is that you're going to get out of this, to a large degree, the benefit from the time that you put into this, the time and effort. So you really can't get by on this by studying a few minutes a day, even if that's been successful for you previously. This is going to take hours and hours throughout a week. It's going to be a job to you that's going to require you to do this over and over again, week after week, to meet your challenges and succeed. So you want to make sure you're thinking about it kind of like a job. So we need to schedule things. We got to put stuff into our actual schedule. However you do that is up to you. And if you're not a big schedule person, this is a great opportunity because it's really easy to set this up as a schedule compared to other things that are in your life. This is a great opportunity to start learning the skill, and it'll help you throughout the rest of your learning and career, obviously. So for scheduling, what you want to do is make sure that you're blocking out time every week. You're putting it down on a schedule, whatever schedule you use in your life. It could be paper, could be on your mobile device, whatever it is that you do to keep track of things that you have to get done daily, weekly, whatever. That needs to kind of be the same schedule you're going to use for this stuff, so that it's not somewhere else. It's not a secondary device. It's not a secondary program. Put it all in the same place because it's got to eat out of the same time that you have. And if you make the mistake of putting it in other places, then link to that so that when you look at a daily schedule, you know realistically, well, I can't go and do this because I've got to spend 2 hours studying. Then it's not flexible. It shouldn't be flexible because people are going to rely on you based on the education that you learn in your training programs. So not just blocking out time to study, which is essential, and do it daily, even if it's a little bit some days and a lot other days. Keep the education muscle working every day of the week if you can. But as you're going through this, also block out when you're going to work on what. Very often you'll have competing classes or competing deadlines that you're going to have to work on. Even if you're taking one class, maybe there's a long-term project, but there's weekly things that you have to get done. So as part of your scheduling, you want to plan ahead. And in planning ahead, you want to look forward to what assignments you have and just kind of browse over how much reading am I going to have to do, all of those things, and start actually scheduling them into your calendar so that you block in enough time and they become part of a list that you need to complete. It's no longer optional for you. And I can't say enough how essential this is. Without this, the rest of this may not work for you at all. It's essentially the first starting place. After you have your schedule down, though, also don't forget to put schedule time in for you to take breaks. Schedule time for you to do things that are good for you and your mental health, because this is likely a very rigorous training program for you. And even if it's just mentally rigorous, you're still going to be exhausted. You're still going to need some means of stress relief. So schedule in time for you while you're at it. Don't leave it out. If it's not on the schedule, when things get compressed, then it doesn't get done, as you know. Okay. Now, when you're looking ahead, make sure that as you look ahead, you're starting to think about not just what you have to get done, which is essential, but think about what is the topic? How is it that this next chapter is going to connect to what I'm reading now? Just loosely think about it. You don't have to dive into it, but give some mental energy so that you know where you're going next as you're reading a chapter. You're kind of thinking, well, this might connect to another chapter somewhere else. You're kind of thinking ahead of that, but you're also priming your mind to start grouping things together as you prepare for quizzes and exams as well. Now, how you study is important, not just how long you study. I do unfortunately have students that start in the beginning of a term and throughout the term communicate with me and they find I'm spending the time you're asking. I'm doing 40 hours a week working on my paramedic training, but I don't feel like I'm getting the grades out of it. Well, that does happen, and we don't want that to happen. So we got to find out what's wrong and fix that immediately. We'll talk about some strategies to do that. But in the process, we want our time to be effectively and efficiently used, right? So the time that you put in, you want to try to find ways to maximize for you, because what works for someone else may not work essentially for you. So be open to the idea that you're going to maybe try new things in your learning process, try things that you haven't used before, and maybe get rid of things that you thought worked for you in this process. Because if you're willing to work on it and fine tune the time you put into it, we can get a lot more out of the time that you put in. And that frees up other things in your life and just rest time also, and decreases your stress. When planning your time, block out blocks of 20 minutes or so, half an hour, and then take a 5-minute brain break where you don't really work on anything. You don't switch gears to something else, maybe not even check email or your phone, but something to get your eyes off of what you're studying, your brain, a little bit of a break so you can process what you just saw, because most of this is compressed into small blocks, but all of it's likely testable. So try and break into your study outline, your study blocks. Try to place in some breaks so that you can just kind of stretch, get a drink, use the bathroom. But again, schedule it in. Maybe set a timer. I'm only doing 20 minutes right now, and then I'll take a break. That's a smart way to work on this, because you can overwhelm your brain, and then no matter how much time you put into an exhausted brain, it doesn't get much out of it after that point. Now, when you go to your future job or the job that you're currently taking a step up in public safety, military, and the like, you're going to have strategies and tactics that you'll utilize to reach the goal of saving somebody or managing a situation. Well, in this, you want to also kind of have strategies and tactics about studying. The way that you approach this is going to help you in limiting the amount of time that you have to put into this versus the amount of energy you get out. Because again, we want to avoid where we're spending lots of time reading something, and at the end of it, we're like, I don't know what I just read. I'm going to have to do it again. It happens. But again, the more we do it, the more tired we get and the less effective and efficient our brain will be if we're just exhausted. We can't pour anything else into it once we're tired because we won't get that back in memory. Now, the strategies and tactics of studying will somewhat depend on the structure of your class. However, these principles you can kind of fit, but I will use a little bit of an example. So if it doesn't line up exactly with your course, try and think about how you can make these pieces fit, because they all really are part of how we teach, regardless of what it is that we're teaching in this line of work. All right, so the first thing you want to do for a strategy and tactic is try and figure out what type of learner you are. You can take some learning tests that are out there. I have one on my chiefsays.com website that you can test to try and figure out what type of learner are you. Now, figuring out what type of learner are you can be really helpful, but it's not going to be necessarily the magic key that you're expecting it to be. We all actually learn different ways depending on circumstances. So when you take one of these exams, it will tell you which learning style is dominant for you, but it's probably not the only way that you learn. So we want to be open to trying things that are maybe not in that learning style, but start with the dominant learning style, because it's very likely that we'll find some tools that will help you that maybe never helped you before. Let me give you an example of how this might apply to you. So a few years ago, we had a student that was taking the paramedic program. The student was very intelligent, had great knowledge of street experience, as we might say, and in the laboratory classes did really well in physical and skills and working on scenarios, like excelled in that environment. But when it came to taking a theory exam, when it came to their theory scores were really not matching their high scores in lab. the student was sitting around at 70% or so on most exams and essentially was kind of on the line of failing. So this student was also a student who had come to me before and mentioned that they were putting a lot of time, 70 hours a week or so, into studying and weren't getting out of it what they thought they were putting into it. So we started working together over a few weeks, and we developed some tools that we tried for a little bit, saw if they worked, then we got rid of if they didn't or added something else, but we kind of worked strategically to make sure that we knew what we were doing was working or got rid of something if we knew it wasn't working. So in this process, the student went through about 2 weeks of trying new ways to take notes specifically in the theory course, just changing the note style that the student used. Now the student started getting B's and then eventually A's on their exams. The student graduated with a very high GPA, and you can imagine the feeling that the student would have having thought that they were not doing anything right, but working really, really hard to get there and not getting any great grades out of it, to suddenly realizing, wow, I can do this. This is lining up with what I thought my image was of me as a medic or currently an EMT, and gave them the power, I think, to really succeed. So if you can find the magic thing is finding the tool based on your learning style, or combination of learning styles that will help you get into the education quickly and retain it for longer. So some of those things are pretty easy to explain. But again, once you figure out your learning style, you'll be able to look at many variety examples on the internet, well outside of the things that I might discuss or provide. As mentioned, be willing to measure and get rid of and try new things as you go through this process, but be essentially scientific about it. Take note of what skills you're using or tools you're using to try and study something. So for example, I mentioned earlier, what type of note-taking are you using? Are you doing notes, or do you feel like they don't work for you? Are you doing notes and they don't work for you, so you should change it up? Any variety of those things. Figure out how you're doing it now or have done it you think most successfully in the past. Try that for a short period. Measure it against something like a quiz. If you perform better on the quiz after you try this thing and you focus on it, then you know it's likely working. If you don't perform better, then you kind of have the decision of, do I keep doing it and maybe it does get better, or let me try something different. But don't try too many different things at one time, because then you won't know what's working or what's maybe confusing the process. Another example is many students were taught to use flashcards as a study tool. And for some of you, that might work really well. It's a great tool if you have to memorize something by just looking at it and repeating it over and over and over again. But some students actually find that writing the flashcard is the thing that gives them the most knowledge, and then looking at the flashcard afterwards doesn't really give them much after. Or some students find that it doesn't work at all. So there's a variety of things that you think are working for you because you've done them your whole life that you might try to change or do differently to see if you can improve in that process. Another example is myself. I'm a read-write learner in one of my learning domains. And for me, flashcards are helpful, but if I really need to memorize something, I write lines, kind of like Bart Simpson does. If I write lines over and over again and say it out loud as I do it all on one side of the piece of paper over and over again, and then I turn the paper over, take a brain break, come back in 5 minutes, can I remember without looking what it was that I was writing down to memorize? If I can and I can write it down, I probably have now memorized it enough. If I can't, then I do another page, turn it over, take a break, come back, blank sheet of paper. Can I remember what I did? Do it again. So who would have thought that to get to a higher level of education, writing lines could be helpful? So again, be strategic about how you're measuring whether or not these tools are working for you. Hopefully, working with your instructor can also help you find tools that will work specifically for their style of teaching as well. Now, regardless of what source you have, what organization or type of training that you're trying to achieve, the structure of the training is likely going to attain some certificate or license in the process of passing the class. That means that whether it's a license, a certificate, whether it's law enforcement, firefighting, military, that means that there's a standard somewhere that you have to achieve that everybody says, once you have the certificate, you're good to go. And everybody apparently agrees on it, right? Like a paramedic license, for example. In the state that you're issued a paramedic license, everyone agrees on the minimum standard of things that you should know and do because it's outlined in law. So with that, learning objectives are a very reliable tool, no matter what resource you're using, a book, taking a class that has PowerPoints, looking for something like a video, taking a live class, or even doing skills. Any of these things will have learning objectives associated with the entire class. Now, it's easy to gloss over the learning objectives, and I don't want you to necessarily spend a lot of time on them, but I want you to know what they're good for so you can use them appropriately. So here I have a paramedic textbook that we're currently using in one of my classes. Again, doesn't matter what the topic is. If you're taking it in college or taking it for a certificate or a license, it will work the same way. When you start off in any class, and we'll start with the textbook as a core example, there's going to be a list at the beginning of whatever module you're working on that shows the knowledge or learning objectives. There might be a variety of terms that are used for them. The learning objectives in most of the online classes that are associated with colleges now have to meet specific requirements, so the learning objectives are usually published in the online environment as well as in the course. So say you're working on Module 1 probably lists which learning objectives you're trying to achieve. Pay attention to those, because that's the instructor or whoever designed the class or mandated the training telling you what you're going to be tested on in advance. It doesn't tell you how you'll get those questions or tell you the question, of course, but it becomes a list of things that you then need to know, because if they wrote them there, they're all basically testable. If they're not on that list, and there are certainly things that may expand upon something, right? There might be more learning objectives as you go, but if they're not on the list, it's not likely they're on the exam. Now, the reason that this happens is because we need to make sure that we're using your time when we design a class appropriately. And in order to do so, we want to make sure that you get what you're supposed to out of it, which is some knowledge, some skill, something that you can use in your line of work. And that likely is going to be tested on at some point, either in a class or maybe have to take for a certification or licensing exam. Now, with that in mind, when you look at those learning objectives, that suddenly becomes a very specific, because they're written in a specific way, a very specific list of things that you have to do if you want to pass the exam or whatever the evaluation is. Once you know those learning objectives, you'll be able to then kind of measure what you're looking at in the content, reading the book, chapter, watching the video, against what stuff is filler information, background information, and what stuff is really important information. Now, this is really up to the person that wrote your book, the person who's delivering the information in the video, but the filler information is probably really, really helpful. But it's all to help you understand those learning objectives. So you want to ask yourself, did that thing, whatever you read, help you understand that learning objective as written? If it did, then you're probably ready to take the quiz, to take the exam on that learning objective, and you don't necessarily maybe have to work too much more on it. Now, there's a lot that's in there. Does that mean you have to read a lot? Does that mean you have to watch a video? That's up to you. Whatever's given to you as your resource of knowledge, it's meant for you to find that information for you as an individual learner with an individual style. It's meant for you to find the information and make it meaningful to you. So there's a lot of ways that you can think about utilizing this. Now, the learning objectives are also helpful when you're trying to tackle a book. So I would imagine most of your classes require a textbook of some kind. So in any textbook, again, you have your learning objectives in the beginning. Start here. So let's talk about a strategy of how to read a textbook in general. And this definitely highly applies for my classes. So if you're looking through the textbook, always start at the first page of the chapter you need to read and review the learning objectives, because that's what this chapter is supposed to tell you. So everything in there relates likely to a learning objective in some way. Then, don't start reading yet, but go to the back of that chapter. Generally, in college level textbooks, at the back of the chapter is a review of some kind. In the review section, you want to review some of the important points before you start reading. So for example, on this page, you can see it has a summary, and this summary specifically is actually tied to a scenario that goes with the entire chapter. But the summary is helpful because if you start here after reading the learning objectives, this is telling you the most important points of the entire chapter. So important that they wrote them twice, apparently. Start with reviewing the summary, because in most cases, you'll probably get the gist of what you need to know out of the summary information. Now, if you don't get what you need to know out of the summary information or the other resources that you're provided, now you know where to go in the chapter to fulfill that information. Now, a little secret. I don't mean to sell us all out as instructors here, but sometimes we have to give you large volumes of reading to address the large volumes of learning objectives that are present. But it's common knowledge that it's very difficult for students to read that volume of information, especially if you're taking more than one class. So I would in my eyes, consider if you're assigned a textbook, the textbook is designed more like a reference instead of a novel. Some chapters you are going to have to read front to back, especially when you're in the very beginning of your training. But other chapters, you likely have been given enough information in the lecture and in the PowerPoint slides and other resources your instructor provided for you. They probably gave you enough information that now you go back to the book and you look up specific things to enhance your knowledge to meet the learning objective. Not everything that's going to be on the test will come out of the instructor's mouth in a lecture, obviously, but the important points will. So fulfill the other points that you need to meet the learning objective list that you have. And now you have your own personal study guide, and you can then strategically think about how much time you need to place realistically on specific tools. Sometimes that means that you read parts of a chapter, or you look up something specifically so that you know the depth of it that you're going to be tested on. Now, in addition, quizzes and assignments will also be written to your learning objectives. And quizzes and assignments, you should review and memorize the portions of things like homework, because they're all used as tools to prepare you for whatever exam that or assessment that you're using in that theory course. If study guides are available to you, use them, but don't memorize just what's on the study guide. The study guide is generally meant, as us instructors, a means of making sure that there's fine points that maybe you otherwise might miss that we want to highlight in your studying. But it's not the full list of things that will be on an exam. If you want the full list of things that are on the exam, the learning objectives is that list. That's where we get our sources of what topics and questions to pull so that you have them available for an assessment on an exam. That shouldn't necessarily be a secret. Now, two last things to think about. After you're done studying, and in my courses, the order of how you study should be learning objectives, look at the intro material, then watch the videos or the interactive lesson and have the PowerPoint and homework out in front of you as you watch the videos. After you've completed the video lectures, if they're available, or other resources I give you, if you need more information to fulfill the learning objectives, then please just go to the books and look up the things that you need to finish those fine details. Certainly, it is intended that the majority of important information I will address in my lectures. So please use that order. Again, I don't recommend necessarily starting with the book in my classes, especially after you've gone through a few modules, but it is a resource that you'll need in almost every module to look something up and review content to your personal level. Again, you're striving for the best grade possible because that means you have the highest level of knowledge to save someone's life in this line of work that we do. Now, after you get all of your studying done, you've now narrowed down the things that you don't know, right? So from your learning objective list or study guide list, after you've done the work, then you should go through it and review it and make sure that you know those topics. Just go through and ask, could I answer a test question on this? If yes, then don't review it again. That then narrows the things that you need to focus on right before you get ready for an exam. Now, the last piece of information is to talk about test anxiety. And test anxiety is an important component of your studying strategy. Almost everybody has some anxiety about taking an exam, especially when you're taking a high stakes exam, an in-person exam, a exam like skills testing or scenarios in lab. Test anxiety is a natural phenomenon, but it affects more people worse than others, unfortunately. Now, you can manage test anxiety, but you have to really think of it as not necessarily something that's wrong with you or something that is emotional, but think of it as an actual physical process. That physical process is that you're having a massive adrenaline dump and your body's having a hard time thinking as a result of that. So if you're in most public safety lines of work, you have to deal with the adrenaline dump that you have in the field to do the line of work job and skills that you need to at a high level of proficiency. So if you already have the skills of calming yourself down when you have an adrenaline dump in the field, think of how you can use those skills right before you take an exam, the same way as you might in the field. You calm yourself down, likely with some calm breathing, focusing on what's important. That's exactly what you need to do when you take an exam. If that skill isn't very strong for you yet, or you're starting this field off as your first learning point, like an EMT basic or an introductory law enforcement academy class, in that case, then that skill can be easily and with practice built for you through some strategies. So what are the easiest way to do this is, number one, get rid of the energy. So that might mean that you have to walk really fast, you have to run around a building before you take an exam. Get rid of some of the adrenaline, because as you know, once it hits, it doesn't go away rapidly. Now that you've gotten kind of your heart rate up to consume, you don't have to do anything crazy or stress yourself out. You're just trying to burn off a little energy. Do that a few minutes before the exam. Now, before the exam and when sitting at the exam, you want to sit down and start working on your breathing. Now, what you're going to try to do is use your body's mechanisms of lowering your blood pressure by taking slow, deep breaths and increasing the pressure in your chest. Doing this will stimulate a nerve in the back of your throat and in your chest to lower your heart rate and decrease your blood pressure. If we can do those two things, your brain is going to have better chances and better perfusion than it would if you were amped up still on the adrenaline without doing anything before the exam. So to do that, you just want to take some slow, deep breaths, and on exhalation, you're just going to kind of squeeze your lips together. You don't necessarily need to whistle, but you're going to purse your lips together, and that makes it hard for you to breathe out, and that holds pressure in your chest. Do that a few times to slow your breathing down. As you do that, your heart rate and blood pressure will go down. The longer you can do that, slow, deep breathing with that resistance exhaling, the longer you can do that before the exam, the calmer you'll be. Your goal for an exam should be to be in parasympathetic mode, because then your brain isn't going to get tunnel vision. You'll be able to use critical thinking, and that's all essential for an exam. So doing so is essentially through the process of getting rid of the energy, slowing your breathing, getting your vital signs back to normal, and of course, all the things to go into it that happened days before, like being prepared through your studies, making sure you're eating right and getting enough rest, and certainly limit the amount of caffeine that you take before an exam. All right, hopefully this information is helpful to you. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. My office hours in my classes are always for these types of things. And don't be shy, don't be afraid to ask, and it's okay to say, I don't know if this stuff is working for me. But hopefully you can use these skills to be successful. All right, good luck to you in your training, and I hope you get the best grade possible.